everybody. Welcome back. I know I told you that I would be starting the book of Esther today, and I will be starting the book of Esther, but before I start the book of Esther, I kind of wanted to just take a minute and get kind of real and ask if you would pray for me, even as I'm praying for all of you. I think as you do something like this, you step out, which I have here, and it's kind of scary sometimes. I don't even know if people are going to agree with what I'm saying or whatever. That is the time very often that we are tested. And I have had several pieces of kind of sad news in the last day or two, and they really threw me for a loop. And right away then, I think it's the enemy saying to me, "You're a hypocrite. What are you doing? Saying all this Bible stuff, and then you're not even living it. You can't even deal when a crisis hits or a tragedy hits or something happens that isn't to your liking." That would be a shame if we get into that. And I struggled with this because I don't want to be a hypocrite. I don't want to tell you we should have this strong faith in God and God is able and He's always there, and then not live that in my life. And I'm telling you right now, I struggle with that. And I'm sure you struggle with it too. The only thing is, we're human, and I'm human, and the only thing I can do is go to the Lord and ask for forgiveness and ask that I would be strengthened in my doubt and in my fear and in my sadness and lack of understanding of God's plan and questioning and doubting. I think these things are normal. And I know when I've read the Psalms that I've really heard that in David's words, that he questioned, he doubted, he had fear. He didn't like the circumstances. I don't like the circumstances. I don't like being stuck inside. I don't like being here when I'm ready to go home. There's many things I don't like. And I would be a hypocrite if I tell you that I was able to 100% live every single thing that I'm telling you I learned in the scriptures. That's also partly why I personally want to stay in the scriptures on a daily basis, because it doesn't take long for me to lose heart and to be depressed and to get down in the dumps and to not like my situation and to look at the circumstances instead of looking at God. So I decided today to at least tell you that, so it's real, so it's not, I'm not the be all and end all. I struggle mightily with all this stuff, especially when I get sad news. And the sad news itself doesn't really matter. It's not my story to tell, but even beyond that, we each have our own thing. We each have sad news here or there. Somebody we know, somebody in our family, somebody that's hurting, some situation that's not to our liking. And it's not easy. But part of why we study the Bible every day, first of all, is to bring us back to that central focus of God's love and protection, and strengthen our faith. And secondly, that when the bad times come, we'll be more prepared. So I feel I'm more prepared, but I don't want to be a hypocrite and tell you that I'm not struggling, because I am. And I know some of you are too. Some of you have had to face some pretty difficult things. So having said that, we'll get into the book of Esther. I just want to say, if you have your Bibles, we're starting in the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. These are all the early days of the Israelites when God called Moses and they went in the promised land and all of that. Deuteronomy, Duo 2, it's the second telling of the law. So that's Deuteronomy, and there's many things about the early life of the Israelites. Then we get to Joshua. Joshua was the person who brought them into the promised land. So now we're into the promised land. After Joshua comes Judges. This is the time period that we were looking at before, and Judges is followed by Ruth. So we've looked at somebody from Judges, who is Deborah, and then we also looked at Ruth. And those two women are from that time period where the judges reigned. Okay, and that time period ends with the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So the time of Judges comes to an end as Samuel anoints a king for Israel. And eventually, he anoints David as king. And so that's all told in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Okay. Also in there are different times when the Israelites fell away, and of course they were captured. And so then we get to a time period where they were captured by the Babylonians. And here we have the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And these all take place when King Xerxes was, well, they don't all take place when King Xerxes was there, but Esther's story takes place when King Xerxes was on the throne. So this would be in the 5th century, about 480 years before Christ. The reason Ezra and Nehemiah are important is this story for Esther covers like a 10-year period when in the Old Testament, right after Ezra and Nehemiah left, and they were given permission by the Babylonians to go back and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This captivity took place over like 100 years. So they got pretty settled in Persia, you know? And so eventually Ezra and Nehemiah want to go back and rebuild the temple. And first Nehemiah goes back and then Ezra goes back. They take groups of people with them. So meanwhile, the book of Esther takes place then right after that period when there's still a lot of Israelites living in this captivity place of the Babylonian Empire in Persia. And it's important to know that they had been there a long time, generations. So therefore, this was their home at this point. And some of them probably had been born there and didn't know any different. They didn't even know. So the cast of characters in this story, obviously there's Esther. And Esther was a Jew, a Jewish woman. Okay. At this point, they'd been in captivity for so long that not everybody knew who was a Jew and who wasn't. Sometimes you couldn't even tell by the way they lived, which is very sad, because they became part of that culture. But anyway, Esther was a Jew. She also has an uncle in the story. His name is Mordecai. He also is Jewish, and that was her uncle. Then there's the king of Persia, King Xerxes, and he kind of comes off in this story quite like a buffoon. He drinks a lot in this story. There's a lot of drunkenness. And he makes very rash decisions, probably because he drinks too much. And then we have Queen Vashti, who is married to King Xerxes, and she's very, very beautiful. And then we also have a villain in the story, and his name is Haman. And he is an advisor kind of to the king. And we think of him as being Persian, but he really isn't. He really is what they say in the Bible is an Agagite, which basically means he's from Canaan. He's a Canaanite. So we had looked at the Canaanites before when we talked about Sisera and Deborah and all that. Those people were Canaanites. So Haman is our villain. There's only one person that's never mentioned in the book of Esther, and that is God. God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther. Fascinating, isn't it? Because here are Jewish people, here's a story that's in the Bible, so obviously it has something to do with God or it wouldn't be in the Bible. But actually, not mentioning God kind of makes the story a little more compelling because now it's a mystery. We're looking, as we read this story, we need to constantly look, where is God? What's he doing? How is this working out? I mentioned this before that in my life I have found that there are no coincidences, meaning a lot of things that seem like coincidences at the time end up, in retrospect, you look back and you think, there was a reason for that. God brought that all together for his glory. And I think there's many things in this story that seem ironic or coincidental, and they are not. They are not ironic, they are not coincidental, they are God working behind the scenes to bring about what he wanted to do to protect his people, the Israelites. So, what's interesting about that from a New Testament perspective is that we have that same thing written down in Romans 8:28, and many people quote this verse, but it's a really potent, important verse, isn't it? It says this, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. In all things, even the things that don't look good, even the things in my life that are sad, God is going to work things out for his purpose. It might not be my purpose, but it's God's purpose, and therefore it will be good for me, whether I know it or not, whether I want it or not. Hard words to live sometimes, but comforting, very comforting. So let's read the story of Esther. Let's start in chapter 1. And we'll just read a little bit of it today because we spent a lot of time doing some background. And the beginning of this starts with King Xerxes throwing a party. It says, "These events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia." We're talking a great big area here he's reigning over, so he's pretty powerful. At that time, Xerxes ruled the empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa. So Susa is the capital city. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Mede, as well as the princes and nobles of all the provinces. The celebration lasted 180 days. A tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. We're not talking about just a banquet here. We're talking about 6 months of showing off, 6 months of inviting all these nobles and princes and powerful people and showing them, look at all my armies, look at all my opulence, look at all my wealth, look at all my power. We get a little feeling for the character of Xerxes here, don't we? Of what he thinks is important and how he wants to be the supreme leader, and he's kind of full of himself in a way. Verse 5, "When it was all over, the king gave a banquet for the people, from the greatest to the least, who were the fortress of Susa. It lasted for 7 days and was held in the courtyard of the palace garden." So the last 7 days, he makes a huge celebration, a big festival, invites even more people, and it's in his garden. Listen to the description of his garden. "The courtyard was beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings, which were fastened with white linen cords and purple ribbons, up to silver rings embedded in marble pillars. Gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of porphyr, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine, reflecting the king's generosity. By edict of the king, no limits were placed on the drinking, for the king had instructed all his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. At the same time, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes." So here we have 2 paragraphs describing the opulence of King Xerxes' courtyard and all of his power and all the things he had to show off, his money and his gold and his silver, and all the wine flowed like crazy. And then we have one sentence that says, "And by the way, Queen Vashti was inside having a little banquet of her own with some of the other women." This does not set well with us as modern women. We think, what was this? He's all about himself and none of the women get to come? You know, they're in the house. Maybe they're happier there. I don't know. But what I think is interesting about that is this is being set up now with Queen Vashti probably being a little bit irate with her husband. I mean, this is a big show of wealth here, you know, and maybe she's a little, peeved that she wasn't involved in it. So watch what happens. On the 7th day of the feast, this would have been the last day of this week, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of his wine, okay, he was drunk, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring Queen Vashti to him with a royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze upon her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the king's orders to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. I'm going to stop right there because our time is running out. But I just think this is a great story so far. Here we have this drunken king who's ready to just show everybody all his power. And what he doesn't know is it's really God who's going to show his power in this story. And Queen Vashti, who is very angry with the king, and she says, no, I'm not coming down. I'm not coming down to entertain your folks, and so you can show me off like a piece of property. We don't need to treat people that way, and people who are like that, like this king, care more about material things than the spiritual parts of our lives, always end up in a bad way. So that's kind of where we're going to stop today. And I would just remind you again of this verse from Romans. We know that in all things, God works together for good to those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. We haven't been called according to our own purposes. We've been called according to God's purposes. And that's kind of what's going to happen in this story. Esther is going to be called for God's purpose. Have a great day, and let's pray for each other. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.